Welcome to Protecting the Delaware River Basin from Fracking Wastewater. This is a webinar by PSR Physicians for Social Responsibility. I'm Barbara Gottlieb, PSR's Program Director for Environment and Health. And by the way, this webinar is being recorded. We're here to learn about the proposed regulation of fracking wastewater in the Delaware River Basin, why the proposed regulation falls short in our eyes, and also why PSR is particularly concerned about Pfas chemicals, also known as forever chemicals. So thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know us, PSR is a national organization founded and led by physicians and encompassing health professionals of all types, as well as concerned lay people. We address two of the greatest threats to human health and survival, climate change and nuclear war. And we educate and engage health professionals to take action through education and advocacy. Our main speaker today is my colleague, Dusty Horwitt, and you'll hear from him soon. There will also be time for question and answer at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, please type them into the question box. But I'd like to begin with some background on the issue that's facing us. The Delaware River is one of the important rivers on the East Coast. It runs through or it abuts the states of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. And it provides drinking water to New York City and Philadelphia. It's a river that was severely contaminated in years past and whose cleanup was considered a major achievement. These days, the river itself and its entire 13,539 square mile watershed, the watershed that drains into the river, known as the Delaware River Basin, this is all protected by policies that are established jointly by the governors of those 4 states and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers representing the federal government. They operate through a body known as the Delaware River Basin Commission. That commission has prohibited high volume hydraulic fracturing or fracking for fossil fuels within the basin. That's the good news. However, the commission is now proposing only partial controls on 2 other issues that are related to fracking. First of all, they propose to ban the discharge of high volume fracking wastewater to land and to water in the basin. PSR believes that the commission's is a laudatory but incomplete step. It doesn't adequately protect the basin from contamination. First of all, wastewater could still be imported into the basin for disposal, processing, reuse, or storage. Second, it doesn't limit importation of wastewater from low volume fracking, or for that matter, from other oil and gas extraction techniques. These lapses leave the basin vulnerable to contamination by highly dangerous toxics and or radioactive substances that might occur in the wastewater. So what we'd like to highlight in today's webinar is the possibility that among those dangerous substances that might be sloshing around in the wastewater are highly toxic per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. So PFAS are a class of actually thousands of man-made chemicals. These chemicals have properties that make them valuable in multiple industries and in many day-to-day products. They're slippery, they're oil repellent, they're water repellent, and they can serve as dispersing or foaming agents. However, they come with a terrible health risk. PFAS have been linked to extremely serious health effects that include cancer, birth defects, and preeclampsia, which is a serious complication of pregnancy that's characterized by high blood pressure and signs of damage to another organ system, most often the liver and the kidneys. PFAS are toxic in the most extraordinarily minute concentrations. They bioaccumulate or build up inside the human body, and they persist in the environment for so long that they have been given the nickname forever chemicals. The use of PFAS or PFAS precursors in oil and gas operations adds an especially hazardous class of chemicals to the long list of harmful chemicals already associated with oil and gas extraction. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn now to our main presenter, Dusty Horwitt. Dusty is a researcher, an attorney, and a former journalist. I'm also pleased to say that he's currently working with PSR as a consultant, and in that capacity, he's the author of 2 recent reports for PSR. The first, Fracking with Forever Chemicals, was released last summer and marked the first time that the use of PFAS in oil and gas extraction had been publicized. He followed that up with a report just recently released, pinpointing the use of PFAS in the oil and gas operations in the state of Colorado. So Dusty will fill us in on what he has found and disclosed about PFAS use, where those data came from, but also how trade secrets and other non-disclosure provisions in the law mean that we don't know what we need to know about where these dangerous chemicals are being used. So with that, let me turn it over to Dusty and we can stop sharing my slide. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Barb. As Barb mentioned, I'm going to talk about PFAS used in fracking and other oil and gas extraction techniques and how that could pose a risk regarding the wastewater disposed from those operations if that wastewater were to be imported into the Delaware River Basin for various purposes. Just to give a little bit of background on how these chemicals might get into wastewater, the oil and gas extraction process begins with drilling the well. And when companies drill the well, they bore straight through the earth. They will go straight through the groundwater. There are chemicals used in drilling wells before fracking. And I'll talk a little bit about what we know about PFAS there in a moment. And so if those chemicals are used right in that beginning process and they bore through the groundwater, they could go directly into the groundwater. Once the drilling is finished, they install a cylindrical steel pipe in the well called casing. They inject cement down through the middle of that casing. It hits the bottom of the well, fills up along the sides of that casing, cementing it into place, and at least in theory, sealing off the groundwater from the well so that the groundwater can't get into the well, and so that contaminants from the well cannot get out into the groundwater. They continue to drill the well down to the depth where the oil and gas is located, putting in additional casing and cement until the well is complete. And then they perforate the well at great depth underground where the oil and gas are found to create exit holes in that well. And then they inject the fracking fluid. And the fracking fluid is typically a mix of water, up to millions of gallons of water, chemicals, and sand. And that fluid is injected at great pressure. It exits those perforations deep underground, fracturing the formation, which frees up the oil and gas, which is oftentimes locked up in the rock. And then they turn off the flow or they turn off the pressure. That fluid reverses course and comes up out of the well where it becomes wastewater. And that wastewater can contain the chemicals that are intentionally added to the fracking fluid, including PFAS, as we have found. And they can also include naturally occurring contaminants in the underground formation, perhaps the most dangerous of which is radioactive radium, which is a known human carcinogen. And so that wastewater has to be disposed of in some way. So we are concerned that wastewater, among other contaminants, may contain PFAS. And as Barb mentioned, we first made this discovery in a report that we published this summer called Fracking with Forever Chemicals. We searched a database for fracking chemical disclosure called FracFocus, and we searched that database, which is a repository of fracking chemical disclosure from 25 or more states around the country. In some of those states, disclosure of fracking chemicals to the FracFocus database is voluntary. In other states, it's mandatory. In Pennsylvania, for some of the wells, fracking disclosure to FracFocus is mandatory. Those are unconventional gas wells, and for others, the disclosure would be voluntary, and mandatory disclosure would go only to the state of Pennsylvania. So we searched the database and we found that PFAS, or chemicals that could break down into PFAS, otherwise known as PFAS precursors, were used for fracking in more than 1,200 oil and gas wells in 6 different states. Those states were not in the Marcellus Shale area, but they included Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, and Wyoming. But we suspected that we had not found the full extent of PFAS use in oil and gas drilling for several reasons. One is we found 2 scientific papers, one scientific paper, one oil and gas industry paper that talked about longstanding PFAS use in the oil and gas industry. The scientific paper, published in the year 2000, reviewed a variety of data, including patent records, and found evidence that PFAS had been used for oil and gas extraction going back to 1956. The oil and gas industry paper, published in 2008, reported that PFAS had been used in oil and gas extraction going back 4 decades. So those were some indication that PFAS were more widely used in oil and gas extraction than we had thought. Then, following our report in July 2021, the Philadelphia Inquirer published an editorial finding that a type of PFAS called PTFE, otherwise known as Teflon, had been used in 8 wells in Western Pennsylvania. So that was the first time that PFAS use had been identified in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is a key state for the Delaware River Basin, not only because it's in the basin encompasses part of Pennsylvania. And could we show the map on that at this point of Pennsylvania and the Delaware River Basin and some of the oil and gas wells, please? Just bear with us a moment. Okay, so here you'll see a map of Pennsylvania and the Delaware River Basin. The Delaware River Basin is on the right of the map, outlined in yellow. And this map is taken from a report that I authored a few years ago for an organization, Partnership for Policy Integrity. And the map is created also in part by Frac Tracker Alliance. And what it shows is that there's a large area of unconventional gas drilling in the upper right-hand corner of the map. It's circled, 2 counties there are circled in red. Those are Susquehanna and Wyoming counties. Those are the counties in Pennsylvania closest to the basin that have a lot of oil and gas activity, primarily gas drilling activity in them. And so, we're particularly concerned about the use of PFAS in oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania, because some of these wells, as you can see, represented by the blue circles on the map, are very close to the basin. Specifically, those blue circles show wells in which at least one trade secret chemical was used, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so we're concerned that wastewater from those wells in those 2 counties, Susquehanna and Wyoming, and perhaps counties elsewhere in Pennsylvania, could be shipped into the basin for storage, processing, reuse, and other activities, particularly because one of the activities that is very common in Pennsylvania's oil and gas industry is reuse of the wastewater in additional fracking wells after it's already been used 1 or more times in fracking. So, as I mentioned, we're concerned that we know that PFAS has been used in fracking in Pennsylvania because of the Philadelphia Inquirer's coverage. And we suspected that the use was even broader because Pennsylvania, like many oil and gas, or most oil and gas drilling states, allows companies to withhold from the public the identities of fracking chemicals by labeling those chemicals as trade secrets. And so in those cases, the companies will provide the public with a generic name of the chemical, but they will not specifically identify the chemical. And that puts the public at a great disadvantage and raises the potential that people could be unknowingly exposed to very dangerous toxic chemicals. We recently conducted an analysis of those two counties in Northeast Pennsylvania, Susquehanna and Wyoming counties, with a data analyst who has created an open source version of Frac Focus, which is easier to search than the online version of Frac Focus. Could we show the next slide, please? We looked in these counties for, we initially looked for PTFE or Teflon, which the Philadelphia Inquirer had identified as being used in 8 wells in Pennsylvania. We also looked for a type of PFAS known as fluorosurfactants. This type of chemical was disclosed as being used in the most wells in our July 2021 report that we identified as being injected with PFAS. Fluorosurfactants encompass the two most infamous types of PFAS, PFOA and PFOS. And PFOA is so toxic that according to recent drinking water standards, one measuring cup could contaminate about 8 billion gallons of drinking water, which is the amount of water that New York City uses over 6 days. So it's extremely toxic, and we're very, very concerned about fluorosurfactants being used in fracking and otherwise in oil and gas wells, as well as the use of PTFE. So we look for PTFE and fluorosurfactant use in Susquehanna and Wyoming counties, and we did not find any disclosure of the use of those chemicals. However, we found that at least one trade secret fracking chemical was disclosed as being used in 1,167 wells in those counties over a 10-year period from 2011 to 2021. And we found that the mass of those trade secret chemicals was more than 28 million pounds. That's a lot of chemical going into those wells for which the public does not know the identities of those chemicals. We drilled a little deeper, so to speak, and we looked to see how many of those trade secret chemicals were labeled as trade secret surfactants. That is, had the generic name of trade secret surfactant. And that might hide from the public the use of fluorosurfactants, which are a subset of the larger chemical class of surfactants. Excuse me. We found that 508 wells in those two counties had been injected with at least one trade secret surfactant over the last decade. And those trade secret surfactants, the mass of those trade secret surfactants totaled more than 1.3 million pounds. And considering the toxicity of something like PFOA, that's a very concerning number. Again, we don't know that those surfactants are fluorosurfactants, but it's possible that they could be, or at least some of them could be. And the public should know what these chemicals are, but we don't. And so that raises the potential of unknowing exposure to very dangerous substances. There are a couple of other ways in which oil and gas companies can avoid disclosing their chemicals to the public, including in Pennsylvania, that I should mention, which have implications for PFAS use. As I mentioned, the first step in oil and gas extraction is, at least the first underground step, is drilling the well before fracking. And there can be chemicals used in that process. One of the scientific article I mentioned earlier that reviewed a lot of patent data showed that oil and gas companies or chemical companies had at least proposed the use of PFAS in drilling of oil and gas wells. And so it's possible that companies could be using it in that stage of the process. But in Pennsylvania and in most other oil and gas drilling states, companies are not required to disclose to the public their drilling chemicals at all. The only state we know of that is an exception to that is Ohio, which does require disclosure of drilling chemicals during the first stage of drilling. But even there, Ohio allows companies to withhold those drilling chemical identities as trade secrets. So it's possible in Pennsylvania that companies could be using PFAS in drilling the wells, and that some of that drilling fluid could come back up out of the well and be wastewater that could potentially be imported into the Delaware River Basin. A final and important means through which companies, oil and gas companies, can avoid disclosing their chemicals to the public is that in Pennsylvania and other states, disclosure of fracking chemicals is required for well operators or well owners. These are companies that are further down the supply chain from the chemical manufacturers who know best what kind of chemicals are being used in the oil and gas wells. And we've seen evidence in Pennsylvania where attorneys have asked for documents from oil and gas companies, from well operators, and the well operators have said, we can't tell you all of the chemicals that we're using because the chemical manufacturers haven't told us. And so if that is the case, the oil and gas well operators would not be able to disclose those chemicals to the public, not even under trade secret protection. We simply wouldn't know what they're using. And so we're concerned that PFAS could be used in Pennsylvania, unbeknownst even to the well operators, in addition to being unbeknownst to the public. Excuse me. So our concerns are intensified because we know that there are frequently pathways in oil and gas drilling and fracking through which people could be exposed to wastewater. There have EPA conducted a report on fracking and drinking water in 2016 and found that one of the potential pathways through which drinking water could be contaminated involved the spills from wastewater. When wastewater is trucked or otherwise transported, it could spill, it could contaminate groundwater, it could potentially also run off into surface water. So that is a real concern if this water, if the wastewater were to be imported into Pennsylvania for storage, reuse, disposal. Excuse me. And so this is why we're recommending that the Delaware River Basin Commission go a step further in protecting the basin by preventing the importation of any oil and gas extraction wastewater. I also just want to mention that EPA in that 2016 report did not draw any distinctions in raising concerns about the toxics in oil and gas wastewater between high volume fracking and low volume fracking. They did consider wells in that report that would be low volume fracking according to the Delaware River Basin Commission's definition, and found that there were toxic exposure risks throughout the fracking process without drawing any distinction. So that's one of the reasons that we're concerned about the importation of all types of oil and gas wastewater into the basin. Barb, did you want to step back in and say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Dusty. Sure. Yeah. One point I'd like to add in regard to the deliberations of the Delaware River Basin Commission is that they are also considering whether or not to allow the export of fresh water from the basin to be used in fracking in other locales. This is another position that PSR thinks is a very poor idea. They are taking some of the necessary steps to protect their own citizens, their own residents from fracking. We certainly would not like to see them giving away or selling the water of the Delaware River Basin to facilitate fracking in other places. So I just wanted to add that point. What I'd like to do now is to pivot to look at some of the possible, I hesitate to say solutions, but some of the steps that can be taken to help redress this very dangerous situation that Dusty has been telling us about. First of all, I'd like to look at the policies that the EPA, state governments, and even some local governments can take to reduce the risks from PFAS in oil and gas operations. These are broad recommendations that PSR has put together. Julia, could we see the next slide, please? Thank you. So obviously the first one is to halt the use of PFAS in oil and gas extraction. States and or the EPA should simply prohibit PFAS from being used or manufactured or imported because it may be manufactured out of the country for oil and gas extraction. And the oil and gas industry doesn't really need to worry. There are replacement chemicals for many PFAS that are immediately available and that are less persistent and less toxic. We'd like to see an expansion, of course, of public disclosure. We feel that the industry should be responsible for full and public disclosure of both the drilling and the fracking chemicals that they use, as Dusty was pointing out, before an oil or gas well can be developed. We know that's possible because the state of California, which is a major oil producer, actually prohibits the use of trade secret chemicals, trade secret claims for fracking chemicals, and yet their industry does continue. Increased testing and tracking are needed, whether this is conducted by the states or the Environmental Protection Agency. Someone needs to be determining where PFAS have been used in oil and gas operations and where related wastes have been deposited. And that testing should include the testing of nearby water and soil and flora and fauna for PFAS. Obviously, there has to be funding for cleanup as well as for testing. We strongly feel that the oil and gas companies and the chemical manufacturers should be required to fund both the testing and the evaluation where these are needed, and should PFAS be found, also to fund the cleanup. If water cleanup is impossible, the companies should also be held responsible to pay for alternative water sources, both for drinking and for agriculture as needed. Finally, and kind of at the broadest level, PSR calls for a limit or a ban on drilling and fracking. Now, given the use of these really highly toxic chemicals, including PFAS, although obviously not just limited to PFAS, in oil and gas extraction, states should not be allowing drilling or fracking or disposal of the related wastes. In the areas that are relatively unimpacted by oil and gas pollution, like the Delaware River Basin, and all already impacted regions need to have increased protections. So there are things that you can do now to help assure that the Delaware River Basin is better protected. Can we have the next slide, please? Thanks. The Delaware River Basin is now taking comments on their proposal concerning wastewater importation into the basin and the export of fresh water out of the basin for fracking purposes. We would like you to let the commission know what bad ideas those are. I'd like to encourage you all to submit your views to the commission via their website. It's a very easy process, as you see on the slide. It's really no more complicated than buying something online with your credit card, but no credit card is required. And your comments can be detailed if you like. We will send out a link to this webinar if you would like to return to the invaluable content that Dusty has given us and incorporate any of that into your comments. And on the other hand, your comments can be simple. Now I'll say Dusty wrote the official PSR comments. They're 10 pages long with 5 pages of endnotes. I sent in my personal comments. They were 2 paragraphs. Not terribly weighty, I dare say, my personal comments, but the important point is to let the Delaware River Basin Commission know first that you care about these decisions and that their decision is under public scrutiny. So I'll put the Delaware River Commission URL, the URL for the comments into the chat so that you can copy it. And I'll do that in just a moment. And in the meantime, we can end the slide sharing and turn to question and answer. If you have a question and haven't typed it into the question box, now is the moment, and I'll read them from the question box just as soon as I get this pasted into the chat. Oh, which always takes me longer than it should. Okay, there you go. So we'll start with this comment from Ned Katire. He said that replacement chemicals for PFAS are designed to be less persistent in the environment and in the human body, but many have not been tested for toxicity in humans and especially in children. That's a very good point, and one that I'm afraid brings to mind the difficulty that we see in regard to efforts to replace toxic chemicals across so many industries. Dusty, any comments on that?
Yes. Over the years, PSR and I have spent a lot of time looking at EPA records where EPA has regulated chemicals proposed for use in oil and gas drilling, and those records do not give a lot of a cause for confidence in EPA's regulation. So it is entirely possible that some of the replacement chemicals could have toxic effects associated with them. So it's a valid concern. EPA has to date not been very rigorous in its scrutiny of chemicals being proposed for commercial use, and has been pretty lax in its regulation of those chemicals when they do find health concerns. Hopefully that will improve. Congress did reform the Toxic Substances Control Act several years ago, giving EPA some more tools that they can use. So there is the potential that EPA could do a better job regulating, but so far there is a lot of cause for concern.
Thank you, Dusty. We have another question here, one that's very much to the point. When is the Delaware River Basin Commission voting on its proposals? They were supposed to vote last fall and it hasn't come up yet. I'm not sure when they're voting. I will mention that the deadline for submitting comments to the DRBC is the 28th, the last day of this month, 5 p.m. Don't wait until midnight. And Dusty, do you know how soon after the comments period is closed they will vote? Obviously, they will need time to review the comments.
I do not, but would just reiterate that everybody should send in comments before the deadline so that they can hear from as many people as possible.
Right. Here's another question. It's addressed to you, Dusty. The question is, what has been the reaction to your reporting on PFAS and fracking? It seemed to get a lot of coverage in some states and some countries around the world. And what was the reaction to your most recent report about PFAS use in wells in Colorado? Why do you think we hear nothing here in Pennsylvania? So the general reaction to your reports, the most recent response to the Colorado report, and then why isn't the word getting out to some of the places that really need to hear?
Well, we've seen a very positive response to our reports in terms of media coverage and grassroots organizations. The July report was covered in the New York Times. It was covered in 2 different editorials by the Philadelphia Inquirer, as I mentioned. Multiple other news outlets ran stories on it. Some members of Congress followed up on our report by sending a letter to EPA asking EPA to scrutinize PFAS use in oil and gas more strongly. That was very positive. Similarly, the report that we just released in Colorado was covered very well by Colorado news outlets, including Colorado Public Radio, 2 different television stations in Denver, the Denver Post, Sierra Magazine, the Sierra Club's magazine, has an online story that's going to be in an upcoming print edition. There are groups on the ground in Colorado who are working on legislation that would follow up on our report. There is a group that has used our report to help push the state to have increased bonding standards for oil and gas companies. That is to require the companies to put up more money up front to cover the costs of remediating and cleaning up their wells after the wells have finished producing. So there's been a good response to the reports. Why hasn't the Colorado report been seen more in Pennsylvania? I'm not sure. Perhaps we could do more outreach to Pennsylvanians about the report. And we certainly will be looking at this issue closely in Pennsylvania in the coming months, and hope we can make this this issue more visible in the state.
Actually, I'd like to elaborate on what Dusty just mentioned. Our Colorado report was the first report in what is planned to be a series of either 4 or 5 additional reports focusing on some of the other states where we have evidence that PFAS have been used in oil and gas operations. And Dusty and data analyst Gary Ellison, whom Dusty referred to earlier, will be doing the same kind of very fine-grained analysis, looking at where do we have evidence that these chemicals have been used, in which counties, in which wells, and in what quantities. That despite the kind of shield over full data disclosure because of trade secrets. Pennsylvania, I'm very happy to say, is one of the states for which we will be doing one of these close-up analyses. It will come out, that report will come out sometime later this year. And we're pretty confident, based on the strong response that we got in the state of Colorado to the Colorado report, and also the very evident concern of the Philadelphia Inquirer, that when we do present the information that's specific to the state of Pennsylvania, I think we'll find a lot of interest and attention.
I will say one other thing, which is that after the release of our report in Colorado, there was a town called Broomfield, Colorado, that enacted an ordinance banning the use of PFAS in oil and gas operations. We were told that was already in the works before our report came out, but we'd like to think maybe our report publication sped up the process. But that is an action that localities in Colorado can take. They were empowered to do that just recently by state law, and that may also be an action that localities in Pennsylvania could take, short of statewide action or action by the Delaware River Basin Commission, because there is some local authority to regulate oil and gas operations in Pennsylvania.
There's one more question. Would it be technically difficult to go to fracking wells and wastewater injection wells and landfills and test them for PFAS? Dusty, I'm going to turn that over to you, and I'd like to add just a little twist. Would it be technically difficult, and would it be legally difficult?
As far as I'm aware, it can be done. One of the considerations is that the PFAS is used, as we know, in fracking in some cases. It may also be used in drilling, but if it's used in fracking, the wastewater that comes up out of the well from the fracking is going to come up out of the well relatively early in the wastewater production. At a certain point, the wastewater coming out of the well will switch from the fracking fluid to naturally occurring water in the formation. And according to a couple of scientists I've talked to, that second set of the second portion of volume of wastewater from the formation would not likely include the PFAS. So there's some risk that if you test wastewater, fracking wastewater from PFAS, You might not find it if you're testing a portion of that wastewater that came out after the initial wastewater production, even though there would have been PFAS that came out of the well. So that's one technical issue that is important to keep in mind. There could also be some difficulty gaining access to sites to get the testing samples, whether those are reuse facilities or whether they're injection wells. Sometimes the wastewater is re-injected underground for supposedly permanent disposal. And we have not looked deeply enough into how easily it would be legally to gain access to samples at those type of sites.
Okay, thank you very much. That seems to be all of the questions that we've received. If anybody else has a question, you can enter it into the question box, or you can enter it into the chat. And if not, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. We will be sending around a link to this presentation, so that I hope that all of you will be submitting your comments to the Delaware River Basin Commission if you haven't already done so. You have until Monday, the 28th to do that. Please do feel free to draw on the wealth of information that Dusty has provided us with, and let the commission hear your voice. This really is an opportunity to protect a very wide swath of land, 4 states, major cities, drinking water sources, and so on. It's very important work, and so thanks very much. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye.